My troop, through whom my words are threaded, as lovers soon wedded turn line to loop. An actor of lip according to rafter, his starry masks bemade of us fathers. Twin writers looking a smile, a frown each, one back to the garden, one front to the beach. And others, and I, as rhyme long hovers, writing the rest into reach.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Soul Scene. This week we're talking about speech. Tell me about the poem, man.
It is describing my solar scene, which for new time listeners is kind of synonymous with ideal. A group of friends who are very artsy and theatrical and writerly. And it's in line with this episode, which is about speech and was inspired in part by us kind of being, I think, a little bit reflective about the way we talk on this podcast, the way we talk outside of the podcast, and at least on my parts, how much the people I speak to and the things I listen to really, really directly shape the way that I talk.
You're
know
like
what
a
I mean?
sponge.
Like a sponge, essentially. So I was like, if I could design in the solo scene a group of people to whom I'm riffing
Sponging.
and raffing
Yes.
and verbally sparring,
Mm-hmm.
then this is what they'd be like.
I like that. The poem was a very clear vision of the people you'd like to have in your friend group, articulate.
Yeah.
And it used a lot of the tips that I have come up with for this episode.
Tips and tricks.
Yeah. So we're going to go through the how, the where, and the what
Sure.
of speech in the solo scene.
Okay.
So we're starting with where.
Where do people talk to each other?
Right
Which
now,
mediums?
where do people talk to each other, Aaron?
Now it's in the DMs,
Sliding into the DMs.
the dreaded Dungeon Masters, the DMs, and it's on
Slack.
MySpace, Slack, Bebo, everywhere but the real world.
It's true.
That's what it can feel like. That's not really what it feels like.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
I feel like there have been days recently where all of my interactions up until 7 p.m. have been virtual because you've been working very late.
Mm.
And so I'll have online meetings and things, and then I'll be like, I haven't spoken to a human.
Do you think that digital communication has affected real life communication?
Certainly.
Do you think it's because kids these days just run around saying, lol,
No.
WYD?
No. I think via text, once we've gotten less specific, it's just like very vague communication,
Okay.
but we've also exaggerated quite a lot. And I think those two things have leaked into real life conversation because online perhaps you rely on emojis or rely on context or codes sort of thing to communicate.
Sure.
And so when we're speaking to humans, you kind of don't know how to communicate something, so you'll just say like laughing emoji or something like that. Flames. Those types of
Flames.
things. And that's like less common, but I think the exaggeration is a bit more common.
You mean slang? You mean it proliferates slang faster? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I also think we exaggerate quite a lot. But like, how do you think it's impacted our real speech?
Well, I was kind of leading with that LOL thing because I think that used to be the fear, like the predictions that older people would have about how text speak would
Mm-hmm.
infect the real world speak. But I don't think that's exactly happened. Like when you speak to young people, they aren't just saying acronyms.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that I wanted to pick up on was actually not so much the words we use, but the way we say them. I think that texting and posting and online communication in general has for sure affected our nonverbal communications and our expressiveness. Namely, I think that young people, myself included, are kind of monotonous when they talk more often.
That makes sense.
Like I think when you hear older people tell stories, they're better at telling stories and they're better at embodying feelings as they speak. And they just feel more, or they sound more expressive. They sound like they believe the things they're saying. I think for young people, it's like, oh yeah, that's lit.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, that sucks.
Yeah, my sister is very much like that, but she's faced a lot of criticism for it. Her friends are always like, why are you just like, oh, that's funny? She's like,
Right.
well, it is funny. Like, it's funny, but I'm not going to like be over the top about it and like
Yeah.
slapping my knee because that's not how I feel. Like it's just that's entertaining.
Yeah, maybe it could just be that we are more numb emotionally, period, and so that's reflected. But I also think often we have difficulty conveying emotion in speech, and it's probably a little bit of a bigger conversation than I was actually prepared to talk about today regarding the way that just like reaction videos and GIFs and the way we almost outsource our emotions or our reactions, our expressions to things that happen in life.
We're probably kind of tired of those like over the top things. So in a way we embody trying to like be counter to those. Yeah,
I mean, I also think part of it is just style. Like I do think it's just a stylish thing to be cool whenever things happen.
That's true.
Stoic even. So I don't think it's exactly just like this is happening to the youth, like bad phenomenon. But another thought I had about the way digital communication has impacted us is that, because I feel this urge too, we want to share every thought. That's so much the temptation that anytime something interesting is witnessed or felt or experienced during the day, I either want to tell the person who I'm near, like, look what I just saw, for everything.
Yeah.
Or if there's nobody near, text, usually you. And sometimes I have to consciously stop myself and be like, that can be saved.
Yeah.
Because if it's that neat, then it would make for a fun retelling in person. And I think sometimes also, like I do this when people text me also. If it seems like it's some kind of interesting news or something that I'm actually curious about, I'll deliberately leave it until I see the person. Like yesterday, you messaged me and were like, oh, I just chipped my tooth. And I was like, what? That's so crazy. But I didn't really ask any questions until I get home because I think it's more intimate that way.
Yeah, I think that's going to be like our first tip of like saving things for being in person, because I have done this quite a lot with almost all of my relationships. If something happens to me during the week that I'm like, oh, I'd like to talk to this friend about, perhaps it pertains to them even. Like, for example, some of my friends and I are going on a vacation soon, and there have been a few things come up that I'm like, oh, we need to kind of sort through this. And I have thought I'll just text them, make a group chat. But we see each other 2 times a week. So it's like, why not just wait? It's not that pressing, and kind of deprogramming yourself to think that everything's very pressing.
Yeah.
And like, if you forget it, you forget it. Then it probably wasn't that pressing.
But I think that's partially also, it's an actually accurate observation that older people make about people our generation or younger. Say, oh, every time they're together, they're just on their phones. And it kind of is true, but I think part of that is because everything that they would have been talking about, they've already shared.
Exactly.
Like they've already texted each other or posted on IG about.
Yeah, and sometimes I fear that I am harming my relationships by doing this because everyone else is doing that. Like, oh, something happens with a boyfriend and then they have to message their friend about it to get advice. But I don't do that, so I kind of lose out on that sort of bonding aspect.
That immediate, distant bonding.
Right. But I think if you're intentional about it and like intelligent about interpersonal relationships, you can still make it work in that you don't have to text someone to ask them for help. You can just maybe next time you see them, ask them for advice, or even just ask them to do something for you.
Are there emojis in the Zoho scene?
I suppose.
Do you use emojis?
Not really. I think I
like
use
them.
2. I use the heart one on almost every text.
That's just like a grandma. X's and O's on birthday cards. Those are basically emojis.
Yeah.
I like that crazy emoji.
Okay.
With the eyes that's all like wacky.
Yeah.
And I think it often means like, whoa, so drunk or something like that. I think it does. I think it means like, oh, about getting wasted and stuff.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Getting turned. But I like using it because I'm not that kind of person, so I think it's funny.
Yes.
If I'm like, oh, just had 2 cakes with that emoji. Yeah, I like that one. I like that one, and I'm also, it's kind of my trademark thing is the frog.
The frog. Your contact name in my phone still just has your full name and the frog emoji.
Yeah, full name, middle name.
It doesn't have the middle,
date
no.
of birth.
Yeah.
Handwriting in the Zoho scene.
Like cursive or just writing by hand?
Both.
Yeah, certainly much more common, our hands aren't going to get sore like some people when they're writing. We'll be much more used to it.
Yeah, I've written many more words in my life than you have.
It's true, but you always say that your hands are sore.
So my thing is I press like a demon into the paper. I press as
that's
if
what I'm
I
saying.
want
We'll be
to,
taught how to write correctly.
Yeah, impregnate the notebook with my
Oh,
ideas.
gosh.
But, okay, flashback to grade 4. You must learn this. In high school, you will need cursive. They will not grade printing, as they called it. We were obviously the last generation to be told that because nobody else gets taught cursive anymore. We were barely taught it. Like, I'm not going to act like I'm from a different bygone era where cursive was the norm because we were not taught it properly.
No.
But the more I think about it kind of objectively, it's a really lovely idea to everybody have a personalized form of handwriting. It's almost feels like an act of rebellion to have your own font in a day when almost everybody's font just increasingly resembles Helvetica. Comic Sans.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I love both of my parents have probably two of the most distinct handwritings I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
My dad's looks like daggers. Just every letter is the sharpest letter, like even the O's.
I think that's just how dads write. I think at some point the paternal instinct kicks in and you just start writing like you're
stabbing the air.
Stabbing the air.
Yeah, so that's my dad's. My mom's the opposite. It's like little bubbles.
Bubbles.
But it's so cute.
It's so interesting that, I mean, there's probably a reason about being socialized this way, but girls and boys always have different handwriting. And there's that whole science about you can analyze personality by handwriting, and I'm guessing that is losing its effectiveness as people, as I say, write more and more like Helvetica. And even you and I, we both print more often than not.
Also, our writing looks eerily similar.
That's what I was just going to say.
It's very creepy.
we say it's eerily, but I'm sure it's almost the standard at this point. Because how much variation can there really be when an O is just circle?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that should come back in the Solacene. Handwriting is such a neat thing. And also, I was telling you this week, I saw an ad, a targeted ad online about a tablet that feels like paper. I don't remember the name of it, but it was like the third version of it. And the commercial that I sought out because I was so intrigued by it, and I thought it would be worth a Solacene mention as an example of un-Solacene technology.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty much the whole selling point is just, look, it mimics paper. There's no distractions. And it really feels like it. And it's like, so does paper.
Have you heard of paper?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very un-Solacene. So in the Solacene, we'll be handwriting more. Do you think there'll be letters being sent more often? Okay.
I think there'll be letters being sent often. I do reflect sometimes about the fact that you and I got to know each other for 2 years or so.
Via text. Yeah, and I remember at one point when I was working at the church, I was talking to like my boss, like the head pastor, about like our distance relationship, and he said, "Oh yeah, me and my wife were distant for a couple years, and we had to send letters."
We were sending letters also.
Yeah,
we'll say that, but obviously that was more of a conscious, like, it was more like mini gifts every time rather than the day-to-day communication was day-to-day. It was immediate. Yeah,
so I think letters will be more common. I had that we'd bring back landlines. Not even like the ones that are cordless. Like I think being plugged into the wall, because I think it's important to be able to like reach people quickly. Because when we watch old movies, it's kind of scary. Of like this woman's living alone, she has no phone. The murderer comes in to kill her, and like she can't.
Yeah, I don't find that scary. It's just the way things work. I like the walkie-talkie feature. It's almost like going even more into the direction of connectedness. But I think because it's more that way. Like the Apple Watches you can do the walkie-talkie on. Yeah. I think you need to be within a distance, right? So that's kind of neat. I don't know about landlines. They seem a little bit just outdated for the sake of it. But regarding letters, those are so pure and personal because the other person has touched it, engraved it. You know, like you carve into the paper.
Spritzed it with your perfume.
Did you ever be like in a romance movie and huff the paper after I wrote it to you? Like smell it?
No. You didn't do that for my paper?
No.
That's surprising.
You think I smell the paper?
Yeah, you smell everything. You're kind of like...
like kiss it every night before I go to sleep.
Yeah.
I am a big smelly boy.
You are.
A nose boy, should I say.
Both.
But I think about even... there's obviously the romance thing, but even just friends. Like, you always hear about old authors, your C.S. Lewis's and your Tolkien's, who have volumes and volumes of letters that they've sent each other over the years. And that's such a kind of... I guess because you can keep it and you can quickly scroll through them, unlike texts for one thing. And also there's an effort involved in it, unlike texts. I'll just throw this one out on the toilet. Like
exactly.
You're not writing letters on the toilet. I hope not, anyway.
Yeah. Maybe we should make it a 2024 resolution to write more letters.
Well, it's kind of like you're telling the person that they are worth the inconvenience.
Mm-hmm. And so the price, because it does cost to pay them.
Yeah, like in the Solacene End today, it will always be less convenient to send a letter, but you're telling them, I value you above that convenience. So I guess that's nice. What about those voice texts, voice memos? Which I noticed in your friend group seem to be really kicking off.
It's just common with one of my friends, and then also one of, a colleague, I suppose you could say, that I'm working with right now. And she sends me voice messages for everything, and it's hard to get used to because you can't listen to them just anywhere, whereas text you can read anywhere. And so because of that,
because they might be private.
Yeah, it's also I'm working at exams right now, so there's kids writing exams, and I can't just play a voice memo out loud.
It's annoying.
You have to wait until you're at home, and I think because of that, it makes you a bit more conscious of the communication. So I don't hate it. I think it's also more personal because you get to hear the person's voice.
Yeah.
And it's obviously phone calls would be better, but then you have to arrange a time that you can both.
I think it's something that in a sci-fi it would be or in a fantasy from 2,000 years ago, there'd be a magician who could send his voice in bubbles to other people.
Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of neat. I don't do it.
I know.
Yeah.
I do it to some people, but not to others.
Why?
Because some people... Also, I guess it depends on the topic. If it's something that's going to be 5 long texts,
yes,
then I'd rather just say it.
Why?
Because I find I can express myself better verbally than written.
Maybe that's why I don't do it.
Yeah, you're a very good writer.
That's true.
But I feel like I'm better at getting points across quickly if I'm speaking them. But when I text, I tend to ramble and contradict myself even.
Not to mention all the typos.
All the typos, yeah.
Kind of my last point about where we should talk in the Solacene, where we should communicate, is just a general in uncomfortable places. I think it's good to go out of your comfort zone, especially when it's so easy to shrink into digital, anonymous outlets. Because I was thinking about how so many people today are so anxious making phone calls, myself included. I've gotten much better at it because my family always used to make me, always, on the off occasion that we'd order pizza, they always used to chuckle and make me do it because they knew how much I detested it. I have to build myself up for 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's why is that? Why did people get like that?
I suppose lack of exposure to it.
Yeah, lack of exposure. And I guess another part of this, more of a negative, is that I don't think we should be filming ourselves so often. I think it's even fine or finer if you have somebody else film you, even just your friend put the camera on you. Because then I still think it's in some way a dialogue rather than just you feeling like you are controlling every part of you. Every part of what is uploaded, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think another part of why we're nervous to talk to people is almost every time you talk to someone, there's a tiny form of rejection. Maybe they don't hear you and you have to re-say something. And we're not super used to that. It especially happens when we speak French to people. But in English too, I feel like every time you talk to someone, they're like, what was that? Or maybe sometimes even more rude. But then you feel bad and you start to bumble a little bit. I had a few more ideas for where we talk in the Solacene. I suppose we talked about it on many of our semesters, but having a community bulletin board, just a central physical space where you can post and communicate things within a certain area. Because we often talk about there's events that go on outside our front door. There was a bike race once. Yeah. There have been parades. There have been demonstrations, and we just don't know they're happening. And it's this is no exaggeration on our front doorstep. So why didn't we know about this? If there was some kind of
exaggeration, but
not always
on the front doorstep.
It's, I think, having a community bulletin, newspaper, radio, pop culture, but in a bubble. So I think that's good. Bringing back community spaces that allow for a bit more conversation, because at the moment our only options are really going to a cafe. And I find, I mean, I don't know, I've never asked the baristas this, but I imagine it gets annoying being the only person a lot of people are talking to in a day. Like, people probably dump a lot of having a bad day.
Oh, like a hairdresser or a taxi driver?
Kind of like that, yeah. I feel like they probably get irritated because people are dumping information on them.
Trauma dump.
And that they don't want to hear. But not even just that, just like, oh, you know, like even good things. But I feel like it would get a bit frustrating. So in the solo scene, more spaces for the customers to talk to each other. Because in a grocery store, you're not going to talk to someone for more than like 2 seconds saying, can you reach the cereal for me? Because it's not really conducive to that. But in spaces like bowling alleys, arcades, movie theaters, restaurants. Because imagine having a restaurant where you're a regular. You're going to...
Yeah. Or imagine a cinema where afterwards they have a space that's called like the Feeling Forum.
Mm-hmm.
The Feelings Forum.
Yeah.
Where you're meant to go to discuss the film afterwards or something like that.
Yeah, and I feel like all of these spaces resemble a cafe.
Yeah.
But it's like maybe it's not centered around coffee. It can be centered around food, film, or an activity.
I'm reminded of, I think it was our last year of undergrad, where we were in the same course and we had a project that was to do a model UN.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, adults don't get model UNs.
No.
There is no opportunity for this.
It's
this
true.
Kind of thing. And the reason I'm reminded of it is because I
didn't participate. Yeah.
I took the 0 on it.
Mm-hmm. You've grown since then.
I've grown since then. It was partially, I think we're really good at rationalizing things to avoid facing our own kind of insecurities. So I would always be like, oh, I don't care about this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not going to be of any use to me. But really, I think it was much more a fear of like, I don't want to have to talk in front of 80 people, however many people were in the course.
Mm-hmm.
But you did it. It was fine, right?
Yeah, it was fine. But I've never really had a fear of public speaking.
Yeah.
Which is fortunate. I think that's part of growing up in church, where once a week you'd have to go up on stage and sing a little song or whatever. I had one more thing about where, and this I think we'll maybe disagree about, but I think having people over, because I find there were people growing up who you would just always be like, yeah, come in for tea, come in for dinner even. It's like, we don't like make an extra portion of food in case someone pops by. But I think in the soul scene, not everyone, but I think there'll be a bit more of a culture of that, just like popping by. And I think that's nice. Or
washing
inviting people
feet.
over. Yeah, that sort of thing. Like last night we had a dinner party, and then today I'm going to someone's for tea. And it's like these two things are very rare that they happen, but it's kind of nice. And that it also creates a place of where people can get to know each other more intimately than they could in a workplace or in even like out in public. Like if you're meeting out at a cafe, you're not going to be like spilling your guts.
Yeah.
But perhaps if you're
Take
in someone's home, yeah.
Well, you know, I like the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about hospitality. Come over, play some Guitar Hero. Organism of the Week.
The Organism of the Week. Okay. I chose this and then realized I might have done it before. But some organisms, they just are my favorites. Especially this time of year.
Yeah, but we're
guess?
not supposed to redo. Is it some kind of Christmas spice? Let me guess.
Yeah.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Cinnamon.
Ginger.
Oh. It's twin.
Yeah. So ginger is a flowering plant whose rhizome, root, is used as a spice and in folk medicine. It is a perennial whose false stems of rolled leaves are 1 meter. Do you know what a false stem is?
No.
It doesn't actually have a stem. It's just a bunch of leaves that kind of roll up to make a stem.
Oh.
And then the flower goes at the top. But the flower is directly attached to the rhizome through a tube, and then the leaves kind of wrap around the tube and then support the flower. Kind of cool. The flowers are pale yellow with purple edges. Sounds very beautiful. They originated in maritime Southeast Asia, and that was kind of like the only place that they were native. But they reached as far as Hawaii during the Austronesian expansion, which I didn't know about. But apparently in about 5,000 BP. Have you ever heard of BP also? Because I'd never heard of that, and then I was learning a bunch of new things. But BP is before present, and present being 1950 when they discovered carbon retrograde. Is that what it is?
Is this like the secular version of dating the past?
Yeah.
I don't like that.
I was just...
It's Christmas time. Oh, come on. Let's all do BP in December.
Okay, let's do the math. Like 2000 BC.
Okay.
maybe even more, 3000 BC. So anyway, very long time ago, there was ginger proliferated all over the earth. So that was kind of like the first globalization that happened pre like colonialism and such. So ginger has a rich history in folk medicine, not just in Southeast Asia, but all over the world. And as I said, like as far as Hawaii. So it's native to one area, but culturally it has been a part of many cultures because of this expansion. And so it's in a lot of folk medicine. And I always find it interesting that it's probably the one folk medicine that you can find in like the Johnson & Johnson brand. Because it works for nausea and stuff. And it's also delicious for making gingerbread men. I should have brought one. And smoothies.
1 second. It's funny you mentioned ginger because I actually just whipped up this batch of gingerbread men.
Just whipped it up, did you?
Is this going to be the first time somebody eats on the podcast? No, we'll never break that.
No, we'll
rule.
never
That's
break
the golden rule.
Yeah. So, ginger. Thanks for...
Yeah, I think it's a superfood.
Thanks for being around.
Technically.
Yeah. Cool.
I think that's actually a superfood.
Yeah.
As if there's a strict categorization.
Yeah.
So we talked about where people are talking in the solo scene or which mediums we're doing. So now let's talk about what they're talking about and how they'll be doing so. Firstly, I wanted to mention a pet peeve I have. Big pet peeve, which is the upward inflection at the end of the sentence. And I did that on purposely, but I know that I do this all the time on the podcast.
Really?
I believe I don't do it outside of the podcast, but I think it's my again, I think it's an insecure, like trying to...
It's a subtle insecurity.
A subtle insecurity about trying to get people to like you or something.
Mm-hmm.
I detest it. It's as if you're not confident in anything and you're just asking everything as a question. Like I could be talking about my life and say like, well, yeah, this morning I had this for breakfast, and it's as if you're offering it to people.
Yeah.
And you're wanting them to accept it desperately.
Yeah.
And that might be reading too much into it, but because I know that speech patterns, they just change over time. Like that makes sense. But I really think that's the root of this one. And I think if you notice yourself doing it, maybe record yourself talking for an hour or something. Mm-hmm. Try and stop, because I think it makes you seem weak.
Well, we've been talking a bit about how we downplay almost everything we say by using like, that inflection of the voice.
Yeah, I told you I want to stop saying just. Well, yeah, I'm just wondering. It's like, no, you're wondering.
Yeah.
You're not just arriving, you're arriving.
Yeah, so cutting those words that I often also say, I read, like not claiming knowledge as my own, even if...
Oh, on the podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading that. Or like, I read that.
Because then, for some reason, I have this fear that someone's going to message me and be like, well, do you actually know? Like, where did that come from? You just pluck it out of thin air? And it's like, this is a conversation. It's not
a peer-reviewed study.
Yeah. So trying to be confident. Obviously now we've brought attention to these things and people are going to be listening, taking notes of how many times we do it the rest of the episode.
Happens a lot.
But we're working on it.
Small talk.
Yeah, that was my first point of what people talk about. I like small talk, honestly. It's a good way to live.
How consciously do you approach it?
Quite consciously.
So you have a plan?
Usually.
Okay.
I don't just say, oh, how's the weather? I tend to, if there's absolutely nothing for me to talk to a person about, then I won't.
So let's say today's Sunday, we're recording. Tomorrow's Monday, the Monday grind. Someone says, good morning, how was your weekend? What would you say? What would you say?
I'd usually say, I never say it's just good.
Okay.
I would say, oh, it was wonderful. I had this and this and this.
So you describe things that would happen.
Yeah, and I find that often catches people a tiny bit off guard because it's like, well, I didn't want to know what you did. But then at least it opens up an avenue for them to say, oh, you recorded a podcast. Oh, you met up with friends. These types of things. Yeah,
small talk it's this thing where, because I used to detest it. I used to be really, and you can testify, I used to be like always bemoaning small talk. I like big talk. Why does everybody small talk? Blah, blah, blah. But really, it's an indictment on you. If you are, because small talk actually shouldn't last for very long. Because that just means you're bad at it, basically. Small talk is effectively whatever you want it to be. If you want it to be a gateway into actual discussion about what you did on the weekend, what they did on the weekend, getting to know each other, then you can easily pivot into that. If you want it to be about politics, what Biden said, or what the Montreal Canadiens did in hockey, then you can easily pivot it into that. You know, like you can actually make it whatever you want to be if you have a modicum of awareness and skill in it. For me, I think that's why I ask, like, how consciously do you approach it? Because I don't really usually think about these things.
Okay.
But what I've noticed is that I will most often look for a joke immediately. So, like, if someone asks me, like, oh, what'd you do this weekend? I'd be like, well, I tried pomelo.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I talk about fruit or something like I always look for, like, a kind of innocuous gag. And again, I don't know if this is getting to, like, therapy episode, but I think there's some relevance to it. I don't know if this is me just not wanting to engage in anything more substantial than that. Or maybe I just like I like laughter. Like, that's kind of what I value in social situations.
Yeah.
It's like, how quickly can we both laugh?
Mm-hmm. And for me, I find when I don't go into small talk consciously is when I go away from it like, why'd you say that? Sort of thing. And I think it's really important to try and intentionally improve your small talk skills as a way of humanizing the people you are passing on the street. Like, passing on the street is a bit extreme, but the person at the cashier, to just not even say, how are you, is, I think, a little dehumanizing.
Yeah.
A few times that I don't go through checkouts very often because everything is self-checkouts, but there's one grocery store here that only has real checkouts. So whenever I say, oh, how are you doing? Like, people are almost surprised that I asked them. Because I think we've all gotten so tired of it.
Yeah, I remember when I was a cashier, and there'd be some repeat characters who you'd always have the exact same stock interaction with, and it was so funny. And even some people would make the same joke every single day, or say the same thing with the exact same intonation. The thing is, online, there's no small talk. Like, if I go on Reddit and want to talk about Biden, I can go straight into it.
You don't have to break the ice.
Don't need to break the ice. Don't need to introduce myself.
Yeah.
Don't need to first establish anything in terms of, like, social. You just start talking because it's anonymous and it's online, and there's no kind of social cues or obstacles that you need to navigate. So I think that might be why people are losing patience more in real life with small talk, if that's happening.
Yeah.
But in the social scene, of course, it exists. Like, it's pretty much just talk among strangers. That's what small talk is. Because very quickly, like, even with coworkers, if you work together for a month and you like each other, there's no more small talk. You're just immediately into talk.
But there has to be some sort of breaking the ice. I'm sure when we met, there was small talk at first.
Do you remember what it was, though?
You said bananas are a berry.
That's exactly an example of what I was talking about. I always talk about fruit because I find fruit funny.
Yeah.
And if someone else finds fruit funny, then that means we're on common ground. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's if you establish a shared sense of humor immediately, then to me that signals this person is probably like me.
You've been saying that lately, that humor is... I never really realized this about you until right now, that is your language.
Yeah.
Humor. Because I feel like I used to be, but then I got too sarcastic. That it was probably veering into mean.
Yeah, it's not necessarily sarcasm.
No, you're not
like
sarcastic, but I mean with me.
Yeah.
And so I've stopped being sarcastic, and therefore I feel like I'm not the most funny person anymore.
Maybe also this is about the meme exchange. You know, like if you randomly sitting next to someone in class, like, look at this. And it's a picture of a cheeseburger with the buns and the patties.
Beef sugar.
But I think that's what that is. It's just maybe a more modern version of it. You know, sharing the memes in the group chat or whatever it may be.
Yeah. I have another which is constructive conversation, which is very Solacene, and that's what we do every week and strive to do every week. And sometimes we can fall short of that, I think, talking too much in the weeds of, like, the bad things, or perhaps even too fantastical at times.
Oh, right. Okay.
So being constructive, and I think people in the Solacene maybe they see an issue, because right now the common grounds, I was recently added to a Facebook group called Rant and Rave of my hometown, and people are just constantly posting, can you believe this has happened to me?
Yeah,
and so I feel like that's the common ground.
I was thinking, the common ground, in my experience of most adults, is like, look at this new road development. Like this roundabout, what a mess that is. How are they allocating this much money for this? Why is the construction taking this long? But like, it's always, I mean, it's shared, which I guess is good, but it's gripe. So gripey.
And it's like, we know that everyone hates it. So why not, when we were talking about it, say, what do you think they could do instead of this?
Yeah.
And then I think that would create positive change, because the gripes, I'm sure, get back to the town council who's doing it, but they're
True.
like, well, what else are we supposed to do?
Basically, the solar scene on a micro level is what we're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah, that's neat. I was also, so it's interesting you say constructive, because one of my kind of words of the episode was intimate or intimacy, which similar to the letters has such a romantic connotation these days. Like, I think if I told you I had a 6-month-long pen pal exchange with some other 24-year-old man, that you wouldn't think is that weird. But there would be a touch of you as like, that's a bit weird, because we don't do that anymore unless it's among long-distance relationships. So I think also with intimacy, like that word, we think of it as solely reserved for romance, but you can have an intimacy with just platonic friends. And intimacy, it also doesn't mean like hugs and therapy speak and even talking that deeply about things. It's just the tone of conversation can be like eye to eye, like we're
finishing each other's sentences sort of thing.
But we're on a same wavelength. Like I have an example from this week when someone said to me in small talk, oh yeah, I'm going to a jazz club. And for me, because I have more than a passing interest in jazz and I really want to go to a jazz club, as you know, but kind of don't. But it's always just this object of fascination to me. Our first date, we tried to go to a jazz club.
We did.
But we weren't old enough. I was so interested in it and I kind of leapt on it and I was like, it's a jazz club. And she said, yeah. And I was like, so they play jazz? And she said, yeah. And I was like, so you sit at round tables? And she's like, yeah. And I said, and you eat either before or during? She's like, yeah. And I was like, and there's smoke in the air? She's like, yeah. And I'm like, and there's a saxophone? And she's like, you see what I mean? There's a kind of intimacy here in that, and also constructive in that we're just constructing this reality. Yeah. And often it's not even necessarily about the verbal interaction. Like as people, we're on YouTube if you want to see what I was doing, but you can kind of like, I'm not very good with hand gestures, but I have strange ones, I think. Like for smoke in the air, you can kind of rub your fingers together and you're just trying to feel the same thing as the other person as you're talking, even if it's about something as innocuous about what you're going to do this weekend.
Yeah. And I like this idea of intimacy because I find since the internet, because there's no filter there for the most part, it's not uncommon for everyone to know your life story the way that perhaps it was when I was younger. I didn't have that like detailed like history with people, but now everyone I meet, it's kind of like you don't have that barrier, for me at least, when you meet. But that doesn't necessarily mean intimacy, like knowing someone's whole life story.
Yeah, I don't actually care. Like that's something that actually really does bore me about small talk and meeting new people. So I don't care to say I'm from England, I moved to here, I went to school here, now I'm here doing this. Yeah. Like I don't like repeating that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying and what I've experienced recently is like intimacy and really great relationships can sometimes be like, we don't really know that much about each other, but we adore doing this together and have so much fun and can just like finish each other's sentences on certain topics. It's very nice.
It might also be synonymous with just being mindfulness, with just mindfulness in the moment and in the conversation with the other person. Like something else I realized from this week that I realized it immediately after the fact and was like, oh, I do this a lot. I probably shouldn't do this. Is whenever somebody offers me food, I always, without thinking, instinctively say no thanks. Because someone was eating peanuts and they were like, oh, do you want some? And I was like, no thanks. But then the conversation had been good until then. But then it wasn't like this big dramatic moment, but it took the air out of it for about a few seconds immediately after. Because it felt like you were just being rude to them. You know what I mean? So I guess that's the opposite of intimacy. And I think also regarding mindfulness, it's just about, because that's something I've obviously been conditioned to do from a young age for whatever reason. Not deliberately probably, but it's just happened that maybe I don't want to burden other people or whatever. So mindfulness is about being conscious to override those kind of things and actually processing, like not giving the default, how are you? Good. Do you want peanuts? No thanks. Being kind of thinking, yeah, I like peanuts. Yes, please.
Yeah, or even if you don't want them, be like, I really like them, but I just ate. I'm really full. Thank you so much, though. Something like that. I remember when it clicked for me to not automatically say no to people for everything. Because I would always say no, and then within perhaps even 5 seconds say, actually, yeah, I don't mind doing that for you. Because Yeah, it's interesting. The mindfulness is like simple, but very useful. I think we're maybe bleeding into the how now.
Okay.
So what you were kind of saying with these types of things, I had under the how section as like learning these skills and perhaps it being taught in the home, but also a bit in school. I mean, there used to be rhetoric classes.
Yeah.
Of just like how to mindfully listen. And I think something that we do often is we listen, but immediately dump the information because perhaps we don't deem it important, or it's just unconsciously we dump the information. The next time we see them, we don't ask, oh, how was that interview you had? Oh, you moved. How was that? And I think remembering details of things that people tell you, it's obvious, but we don't necessarily do it because we're so inundated with information. That's a very useful thing in the soul scene.
Yeah. Also, obviously not everyone's going to start a podcast, but this has been by far the most illuminating exercise of my life in terms of changing the way that I talk in conversations, in serious conversations and in passive conversations, has been the fact that I listen back to myself every week and you, and will often give us notes. Like I know, for instance, I interrupt you quite frequently on the podcast. Something we don't do on the podcast, but I thought would be interesting to mention, swearing.
Yes.
Do you
Something we
swear?
don't do on the podcast, but we do all the time off
Yeah.
there.
Oh, it swears like a sailor.
Yeah.
And my first thought on swearing was that, because in the solar scene, I guess we both agree, we don't like swearing.
Yeah, because right now in the solar scene of 2, we don't like swearing.
It's true. My first thought on it is just it's lazy.
I always thought that too.
It's a really lazy way. Most swearing is emphasis. Instead of I really love this, you insert a swear word and people think it makes it stronger.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of in the Harry Potter books, in particular, I remember in the last one or maybe the last few, when it got serious, but J.K. Rowling was still, in my opinion, not exactly a maestro with the prose. She would very often in argument scenes, fight scenes, just do all caps. Like the characters would just scream in all caps with an exclamation point at the end.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's kind of a lazy way of getting across that they are shouting. Like you can do shouting even to stronger effect than that without kind of abusing punctuation like a kid kind of thing. And so I think it's similar in real life. You can actually express yourself in such a way that, let's say, what in the world can have quite a big effect. Like obviously swearing will always pack a big punch because it's swearing. And it's not that 0 people will ever swear ever in the solar scene.
But it'll be a part of vocabulary. I've heard people say this of like, their words, like people kind of in defense of swearing, be like, well, they're words, they're part of the vocabulary. And I'm like, yeah, they are, but like, don't use them.
But don't use them
every day,
especially
even.
not lightly. Yeah, this is kind of, not to get too heavy, but it's kind of godlessness. And I was looking into the history of swearing, and I got sidetracked by the fact that it's called profanity. Yeah, and the opposite of profane is sacred. So I think it's kind of like, especially this ties back to me reading Shakespeare and just having my mind blown every single new poem that I read of his. I think you believe in both or you believe in neither. Like if you think that some words can be sacred, which I really do, I guess that's kind of the goal of a wannabe writer or poet, is to eventually strive to achieve something close to that. What Shakespeare just woke up and just did in his, without even trying.
Yeah, meanwhile, because right now we're both reading through a different author. Yeah. And it's funny because Shakespeare, just everything he's written was like
almost sacred.
But then it's funny because Hemingway died trying to write one true sentence. And it's not that his writing was...
That's a similar quest though, right? I know the style is different and the prose is different and all that stuff, but the point is there's a recognition that there is such a thing as one true sentence?
One true sentence, yeah.
Or like a perfect play, the perfect sequence of words and sounds can mean something akin to just like, some really wonderful paint strokes that you look at and, it brings you to tears and you don't know why. Like, I think if you believe in that with speech or music, like most people will agree that if they hear some really angelic singing, like there's something special to that. Yeah, and it's like, if you believe in that, then you must, it would only make sense that you also believe in the profane or as we call it, cursing. You can weave like a really good magic spell, the good witch, or you can curse. You can make a curse on someone. And by the nature of these two things, we want to do the good thing. And the curse, the profane, we don't want to do. And so that's why I think we should want to do the good thing. And that's why I don't really like how commonplace swearing is on the internet. I was trying to find some stats about whether it actually has increased with generations. I think it has, but that's just anecdotal, because it could also be the case that just young people swear more than old people, and that's always been the case.
That's possible.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I just think in the solo scene, not in every single conversation. And also, even people who are pro-swearing, this is a neat rebuttal that I thought of, even people who are really pro-swearing will usually try to abstain around young children. Like, you're not going to go to a newborn baby and swear in front of it. They won't.
It's true.
So it's like, well, if it's just words, why wouldn't you do that? It's because you have a recognition inside you that this is a pure thing, this is an impure thing, and we should do our best to keep them separate. And it's like, if you treat a baby with that kind of reverence, you should also do the same of yourself and of the other adults around you, I think.
It's true.
Like, why not? Why do we try to debase ourselves? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, my first two thoughts about like how we communicate are very much along the lines of not swearing. It was a positive tone, which I already talked about a bit, but also a more robust vocabulary, because I think often you don't have the words to describe just how angry you are or just how terrible the situation was, so people will rely on a swear word. Like, it was like terrible.
Yes. Like,
not just terrible, like it was like adding a bunch of swear words in. But it's like if we just had better words for it and the knowledge and the recall skills to bring those to the conversation, then I think we wouldn't rely on it so much.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a part of practice and a part of education.
Also non-verbals. Like, if you don't have the words for it, that's where
just punch your hand.
Your punches and your tears and your smile. Like, what a crazy idea. Like, smile as you say something happy or something joyous.
Oh my goodness. That reminds me. One time we were in a group of people talking, and when I'm kind of nervous or trying to get to know people, I laugh sometimes as a sort of nervous way. But someone looked at me and they're like, "Why are you laughing?" And I'm like, well, I'm happy. Like, I was telling a funny story and I was laughing while telling it, or I was telling you something that I was trying to lighten. And I suppose because everything's online, they're not used to someone laughing while talking.
Yeah, maybe you just seemed a bit deranged.
Maybe, but I don't think it was exactly that.
Maybe they thought you were laughing at them.
Could be.
Okay, I had a few more notes. One is, in the solo scene, do talk about politics and religion. I feel like
if you're going to skirt around that, your whole relationship with the person, then but you value, like, the relationship more than your values, perhaps to an extent.
Not just with one person, but with all the people. I think we are, this isn't a word, but we're under conflicted. We're exposed to ideological criticism and conflict. And throwback to our undergrad, where every single lecture hall was a really sad and slow and just boring echo
unproblematic
chamber. Unproblematic, where no one would say anything. And I don't think it was because people were feared of getting cancelled. I think it was more that we never even got to that point. Like, they're just not used to genuinely expressing any thoughts.
Yeah, and I think people now are so close-minded that, even if you say something very simple, perhaps, that shouldn't cause a big debate, it will, because we're not used to being confronted at all.
But we shouldn't be afraid. It's like, okay, you say something about politics that causes a big debate. Like, that's
we should know how to debate and not hate each other at the end of it.
That's how humans socialize. Like, it's not like politics were any less controversial in ancient Rome. But maybe you just talk about it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Also, I think this is more of a personal observation, but I often think it's boring, or I guess slightly below me, but more that it just doesn't interest me to talk about local happenings. Like, this new restaurant, that street's busy, directions, new establishments.
It's like drawn out small talk, maybe?
Well, it's that I have a terrible sense of geography and memory.
I see.
Like, I wouldn't be able to name you a restaurant that I've been to in Montreal. Even though I've been to, double digit at least. But I don't think to remember the name.
I see.
And so when it comes to discussing with people, there is no discussion to be had because I don't even, it's like, well, where was it? I don't know. What was it called? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like that always kills it. So I do think to an extent you can teach yourself to have more socializy skills. Like you can,
I think so.
You can really get good at knowing, for instance, the layout of your city so that if all else fails, you can be the direction guy if you want to. I mean, I don't really want to, but I'm saying like you can do this to yourself.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be the pop culture guy.
Yeah.
He's like, well, Harry Styles' new album. Did you hear that?
But this is what I mean. Like, I don't think you should try and force yourself to be interested in things that you're not.
No.
Like when I moved to Canada, as we kind of laughed about, I tried to get into hockey. Desperately, I tried to start following hockey. But it's not something I cared for. Whereas directions, that's more of a skill. Like that's something you can just attain that has social benefits also. And then my last point is just that you must need to be yourself.
Okay.
Which the reason I emphasize the must so much is because if I just said be yourself, I feel like people roll their eyes because it's such a commonplace piece of advice. But if you really take it to heart, like if you really try and understand it, what that means is that you're trying to present yourself to everybody in every single situation the same way as you. And I think we often don't do this because we're so judgmental that you can read a room and say, no one's going to like it if I start.
So you become a chameleon and like
Yeah, you become a chameleon and you become boring. You sanitize yourself of anything interesting and anything about which you're actually passionate. As I say, you can read a room and say, no one's going to be interested in the solar scene, in the books I'm interested in the movies that I just watched. Like, no one's going to care about that. And that might be the case. But what I'm saying is you should always be yourself. Anyway, you'll fail more often. Like there'll be a faint sense of rejection more often if you're expressing yourself with genuine enthusiasm for the new Studio Ghibli film. But it's the only way that you will ever succeed in finding someone who also cares about that new Studio Ghibli film.
Yeah, and sometimes they might say, oh, my brother is really into that.
Yeah, of course.
And then there's some kind of connection there.
Yeah.
Because I remember when I met you, you were very into Nintendo games and such.
Yeah.
And I wasn't.
Right.
But my sisters both were. So we kind of bonded. Like, I knew about them peripherally through them. So we still bonded over that. And then you got me kind of into games.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
Now she's addicted. But it's the fact that we make ourselves as boring as possible. And then this is kind of what I was getting at with my own prior complaints about small talk. And then have the nerve to complain about boring people in small talk. It's like, but you're one of them.
Yeah.
You're not differentiating yourself at all. And it is about the risk of appearing like a fool.
Yeah, for sure.
Which you do risk, and it will happen. But like I say, it's also the only way that you'll ever make actual friends. And I think this is also has an internet root to it, because we can always just say in our workplace or in our school or at the cafe, none of these people care so much about Nintendo, but my friends online,
they love it.
They love it.
Yeah.
But they're not real friends. So I guess that's kind of my last point also. Always act like the internet isn't a real place, which it isn't.
It isn't. Yeah.
Because something else is when in conversation we say so frequently, oh yeah, I was reading about this, or I saw a few people talking about Starbucks changing their Christmas cups or something like that. It's like, but you didn't see anybody in the real world talking about this at all.
Yeah.
You read probably a headline from some really low level, like tabloidy aggregator, which found 3 people putting a GIF on Twitter and decided to try and package it as a real social phenomenon. And then you're kind of doing the same, proliferating it. But it's like, those people don't, like, that never happened in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. I was listening to a podcast and the hosts were talking about analysis of the internet, and they were going to those websites that are very, like, very, very far left, feminist or whatever it might be. And then they searched who shared those on Twitter.
Yeah.
And 10 times out of 10, the people who shared them on Twitter were the far right people.
Yeah.
Saying, look at all this nonsense that they're talking about. It's like, these are basically sometimes genuinely just created as a way to make people hate the left.
Of course.
But other times it was just like, they're just 3 people who have this website and they have stupid ideas.
It's why touch grass is such a great, like, online retort. Because it just means go outside. I don't see anybody on the street corner talking about how Jamie Oliver should be cancelled for making Jamaican rice.
It's true.
Because there aren't actually people doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you should probably only concern yourself with what's happening in the real world.
I agree. My final point was just one word, empathy.
Oh. No.
But I think we lack it sometimes. Especially because if you have empathy online, then you're going to be burnt out from caring. But then you don't have empathy in the real world and someone tells you that their dog died and you're like, that sucks. And it can't even be like not in extreme things, but if someone's telling you what their passions and you do not care, you're like, I do not care about soccer, stop talking about it. It's like having empathy would be like, well, they are passionate about it. I'll listen, maybe retain a couple facts, maybe even look into it. Like, and you don't have to go that far, but it's just we lack open-mindedness and we lack empathy.
Or you find
a
parallel.
Exactly.
Like that's why empathy is similar to imagination. Like if I'm telling you really excited about football, Messi finally did this, it crowned his career, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know about Messi, don't care about him, don't care about the World Cup. But that reminds me, I'm actually just going for my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that would be a similar feeling.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like triumph. Mm-hmm. So you can at least find these kind of elemental parallels in seemingly really disparate conversations.
Yeah, of course. But it's a skill and it's like takes practice that we lack. So thank you all for listening. If you want to become a better speaker, start a podcast and listen to yourself for hundreds of hours.
This should be what we do now to sign off. Salute.